mysterious. Welcome back, everybody. I got a fun one today. Today's Bigfoot encounter comes to us from Drew, who grew up in northern Ohio. Before we jump right in, if you haven't already hit that subscribe button, please smash that for me. I greatly appreciate it. And drop it in the comments where you're listening from, what part of the world you're in. Well, let's get into today's encounter. Again, this one comes to us from Drew. He starts, I had just graduated high school the year before and would occasionally head over to the school parking lot to hang out with some of my old friends and chew the fat. My friend, Ernie, had a 1967 Impala Super Sport 396 cubic inch 4-speed. It was blue with a black interior, and he kept this thing up like it was the last car on earth. I was in the school lot this particular day, casually walking around his car, when I noticed a couple of small dents in the driver's door and front fender. The finish on Ernie's car was like glass, and I had never seen any chips, let alone dents in it, so I asked him what happened. He told me that he and his girl, Marianne, were up at the overlook the other night, and some homeless people were throwing rocks at some of the cars. I told him I'd never heard so much as a homeless person in the entire county in all the days I'd lived there, which was my entire life. He said, yeah, they are there, all right. And with the exception of those who don't know any better, nobody is parking there anymore. I thought this was the nuttiest thing I'd ever heard and decided to take matters into my own hands, so to speak. At the time, I was driving a 1973 Nova that was in no way, shape, or form in the condition of Ernie's car. That being said, I decided to do a little experiment. This particular parking area was somewhat of an overlook at the end of a dirt path where kids would stop and listen to the radio at night. I'd been there many times in the past, and I had certainly never had any rocks thrown at me. But it had been quiet for some time since I'd last been there. Well, as it were, I had devised a plan to catch these rock-chucking creeps red-handed. I gathered together a few boys, and each week for a month, we were going to park on Friday night at the overlook. Every Friday, I had 4 guys with me with flashlights and baseball bats. So if someone threw a rock at my car, they were going to get their ass whooped good. On the first 2 Fridays, nothing happened whatsoever, having parked there for almost 3 hours each night. In fact, one night, a cop came by and asked what we were doing. And we told him he just rolled his eyes and took off. The 3rd Friday was a rain out, and after an hour, we just gave up, figuring no people, homeless or otherwise, would be out in the pouring rain, so we split. It was on the 4th Friday of our stakeout when this whole Bigfoot thing unraveled before our very eyes. We were there in my Nova, with the radio on very low, and there was a station wagon about 30 feet from us, with a group of kids in it. This happened to be a moonless night, and it was exceedingly dark in this overlook location. We'd been sitting there for the better part of an hour when we heard a large metallic rap, rap, rap of what sounded like a stone bouncing off the station wagon's hood in conjunction with a girl in the car screaming. My recollection is that it wasn't 10 seconds later when someone said in a loud voice, There's something standing there with glowing red eyes." On that note, the 5 of us jumped out of the car with our flashlights blazing and ran headlong into the woods. I was the first to step in, with my light pointed directly in front of me, when, standing maybe 20 feet away, was the silhouette of a massive creature with glowing red eyes. They were as bright as the car's headlights shining on a bicycle reflector at night. I yelled out, "Holy beep!" The other guys immediately had put their lights on the same thing. This monster just stood there and didn't as much as flinch. We stood our ground as well. I remember the 5 of us looking back and forth at each other as if to say, what now? This thing, which I now know was a Bigfoot, flexed its arms in what I'll call a bodybuilder pose, turned around and walked into the woods. We had our lights on it the entire time. I remember it staring directly into the lights as though it didn't bother it at all. It had to be every bit of 8 feet tall or more, and was as wide as the back of my Nova's trunk lid. As we started to talk, some of the kids got out of the station wagon and asked us what we'd seen. Eddie said, "It was a damn monster." And Kyle exclaimed, "It was a creature from hell." What we could agree on was that we had seen a large, hairy beast with red glowing eyes, and that it had apparently thrown the rock at the car next to us. Both of these were now facts that we knew were true no matter what anyone else thinks or says. A short while later, we left the scene and actually ran into the officer we had previously seen up there, parked in his car in town. When we told him what just happened, he said, "Why don't we go back up and have a look around? That is, if you're not scared." The fact was, we were afraid, but we weren't going to tell the cop that. So he followed us back up to the overlook. When we pulled in, he panned the area with his floodlight before we all got out of the car. And when he asked where we had seen the creature, we brought him to the exact spot. As we looked around, he said, "Well, look at this. Maybe you kids aren't half crazy after all." He had shown his flashlight pointed directly. He had his own flashlight pointed directly at the ground on what was a large footprint in the peat of the woods. He took his club off his belt and laid it next to it, saying that the print was about 20 inches long and 8 wide. It wasn't that we needed any proof of what we saw, but now the cop was on board after seeing the footprint for himself. He said to us that he didn't know what we had seen, but it was definitely not a bear. He added, "Whatever has a foot that big has to have a body to match." We looked around a little bit more and nothing else came of it. And 2 years later, our family had moved away from the area to New Jersey, but the memory remains until this very day. I often feel the urge to drive back to Ohio and see if the spot is still there. Well, that was an interesting one. You don't often hear stories like this where people are so quick to go right back to the scene of the crime, if you know what I'm saying. Usually those things scare the absolute daylights out of you and you don't want to go back. At least in most cases. Well, what do you think? That was, when was that? That was back in 1979. Yeah, well, Northern Ohio, they're up there. What do you think about that one? Drop down in the comments, and if you've had an encounter with a Bigfoot or anything mysterious, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear about it. cryptidmysterious@gmail.com. And I'll see you in the next one.